Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for March 24th, 2021. Well, as you'll see from my report today, the British are at it again. The idea that somehow the British Empire is gone or that the United States is operating on its own outside of the influence of the British, all of that is clearly disproven by events in the last couple of weeks, if not events of the last 20 years. Let's just take a look at this whole myth that came up after Brexit, that the British were going to break with the European Union policy, were going to go off on their own. I mean, just one example of this is yesterday, the British signed on to a U.S., European Union, Canadian policy of new sanctions against China. And the Brits are working with the United States on sanctions against Russia over Navalny, over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. So the idea that there's some distance between the British and the US is clearly false. And the idea that Boris Johnson was going to be some kind of Trumpian figure fighting against the old British Empire, well, that's just foolishness. What we see is that global Britain, which is now proudly proclaimed by Johnson, by the defense minister, this is just another resetting of the British Empire. The British Empire has its own policies, has its own strategic and financial necessities. And one of those is to keep the United States as a partner, as the military partner to impose a City of London global austerity. This is what the Great Reset is about. This comes from London, not from the US. It comes from the City of London, which is attempting to establish a global bankers dictatorship with the full support of the Biden administration. Now, if you look at the coherence between the British strategic defense policy, which was just recently was released on Monday, and what the Biden administration is doing, you'll notice that it's exactly the same perspective. And let me add that this is what Pompeo was doing before Biden came in. For those people who think the Biden campaign or the Biden administration is changing dramatically from what the Trump administration was doing, you must have been sleeping through 2020. Because during the year 2020, the Trump administration and Trump personally finally submitted to the military-industrial complex, unleashing Pompeo, Esper, and others with sanctions against Russia, with the anti-China rhetoric, with a policy of geopolitical confrontation. The president was not allowed to pull the United States out of these wars. Whether he could have done it or not, well, that would have been a real fight, but he didn't do it. He didn't pardon Assange and Snowden. He didn't break the power of the Patriot Act or the security state. And whether that was his own shortfalls or whether it was because he didn't think it was possible to do, that's the reality. And so the Biden administration is more in a continuous policy with the sanctions, with the threats, with the idea of developing the Quad, that is the Asia, NATO to encircle China. All of this is continuation of what was going on in 2020. Now, let's take a look briefly at the new defense paper from the British government, Defense in a Competitive Age, which was released on Monday. And in releasing it, the Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said that the government has to protect and defend the people, and it has a duty to enter new domains. Now, what is this new domain? Now, listen to this carefully. He says, the notion of war and peace as binary states has given way to a continuum of conflict, in other words, endless wars, requiring us to prepare our forces for more persistent global engagement and constant campaigning, moving seamlessly from operating to war fighting. And he said the armed forces of the United Kingdom will no longer be held as a force of last resort, but become more present and active around the world, whether in the Euro-Atlantic, the Indo-Pacific, and beyond. And all of this is needed, quote, to counter growing threats from Russia and China. Well, that's precisely the language that was used by Blinken and Sullivan in confronting the Chinese foreign counterparts at the meetings in Alaska last weekend. That was implied in Biden's silly attack on Putin as a killer. This is, in a sense, what we saw with the Pompeo global offensive against China to organize an encirclement campaign around Russia and China. Now, what he went on to say, and this again shows you the continuity with the Biden policy, Ben Wallace said, "We must actively champion those shared values of liberty, justice, and tolerance that have given billions of souls the world over a chance for a better life." Now, who's he talking about? The British were involved with the United States in destroying Libya, in wrecking Iraq through regime change, in attempting to carry out regime change in Syria, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, displaced millions of people. That's bringing them a better life? Those are the shared values? Well, no wonder much of the world is rejecting them. To do this, he said, there will be an increase in spending of 14% on defense over the next 4 years. And he concluded by saying that the armed forces will no longer be held as a force of last resort. And this is the idea of a global empire with the United States. And of course, the United States is key for this because the British can't really equip and maintain a global army. They can't even keep a squadron of planes on their aircraft carriers. They have to borrow the planes from the U.S. Marine Corps to have the F-35 fighter jets on their aircraft carriers. Now, what are they engaged in here? This is what some people call the Anglo-American Empire. And if you go back just in recent history, you look at Kissinger's 1978 speech at Chatham House, where he said he often worked from British Foreign Office working papers in shaping U.S. policy. He admitted it. Thatcher's role in convincing Bush Sr. to go into Iraq. She said she had to stiffen his spine. The role of Blair with Clinton, getting the United States to engage in the Balkans War, getting the United States, when Blair worked with Bush Jr., to shape the whole campaign against Iraq. And Obama was a total creation of the British. His foreign policy was a defense of globalization, free trade, a defense of the International Monetary Fund and its policies that destroyed countries all around the world. And so when we look at this so-called shift in British policy, what we see is it's not a shift, it's a continuation of what we've had since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990, in which the U.S. declared itself the unilateral force to shape a rules-based order. And this has been the policy coming from the City of London and Wall Street. And this is the policy of the military-industrial complex in the United States. Now, what is a rules-based order? The first question is, who makes the rules? Why is it okay for the United States to go in and bomb Iraq, destroy cities in Libya, arm and train terrorists in Syria, but it's not okay for China to go in and build a railroad in Kenya? What kind of order is that? That has nothing to do with justice or fairness. It has nothing to do with the security of the West or the people in those regions. This has to do with sustaining a global empire based on financial looting, based on speculation, based on destruction of physical economy, and ultimately based on depopulation. That's the key point. This is where you see the intersection of the ideas of the Bushes in the United States and Prince Charles and Prince Philip, who wished to depopulate the world. This is what the Green New Deal is. This is what the Great Reset is. So what we're looking at is a commitment to reduce the world's population based on fake science, but more importantly, using the fake science to justify policies of bailing out the Davos billionaires, bailing out the bankrupt corporations, the bankrupt governments, and putting a coalition of corporate cartels, including especially finance and insurance, to run the world. That's what this British defense policy paper really is signifying. That's what the Biden policy and the confrontation with the Chinese in Anchorage was about. the threats against Putin, that he'll pay a price. And that's a continuation of the policies of 2020 of the Trump administration, not of the earlier part of the Trump administration when he tried to establish a cooperative relationship with Putin and actually succeeded for a while in moving ahead with the denuclearization of North Korea, of defeating ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria. But that's all changed. So the question is not to defend one regime or another, one administration or another, but to look at the continuity and see what we're up against. And this is what we have to fight. And we have allies all over the world, including tens of millions in the United States who are tired of war and want to move to a new paradigm. And that's why the Schiller Institute conference this last weekend was so important. So I'll be back with you tomorrow. Thanks for joining me today, and be sure to share this video. Thanks and bye.